Conway Hall, London, where ethics matter.
Right, good afternoon, and I can say that because the clock's just struck 12. And this session, the third session of the day, is on corpse roads and digital landscape archaeology. Britain has many ancient pathways, such as corpse roads. These were pathways taken by coffin bearers over the countryside before the enclosures happened. So what can the latest digital landscape modelling technology tell us about this secret landscape under our feet? Professor Stuart Dunn is a Professor of Spatial Humanities at the Department of Digital Humanities, King's College, London. Welcome him. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. I think... that's a relief. Good afternoon, as it is indeed afternoon now, and thank you very, very much for the invitation to be here today. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to give this talk this afternoon. So yes, as that kind of introduction said, I am Professor of Spatial Humanities up the road at King's. I've only had this job title since the summer, and I am already getting very good at explaining what it is at parties. So if anybody wants to know what it means, I will be happy to explain afterwards. So I think this talk is going to have actually more about corpse roads than digital landscape archaeology. I mean, this is a kind of nod to my day job where I use mapping techniques and technologies to crunch numbers and understand what is going on in landscapes. And the corpse roads bit is a kind of, I wouldn't say a sideline, but it's kind of an area which I found has intersected with my day job in quite interesting ways. So corpse roads, as stated in the introduction there. So the idea of the churchyard as we know it, a consecrated plot of land surrounded by a wall or a perimeter of some sort, where people are buried, is one that emerges in the early medieval period. Now, the medieval church is never slow to capitalize on its position or its financial place within the community. And so a requirement was when you died, you should be buried in a consecrated plot, of course. Now, many villages, many hamlets, did not have a church with a qualifying plot of consecrated land, meaning that if you died in an outlying hamlet somewhere, you had to be transported to the place of burial. And this gave rise to this network of corpse paths, routes over land, over the countryside usually, very often inaccessible to wheeled transport, so the bodies often had to be carried manually. And as a traditionally, possibly even conservatively trained landscape archaeologist, I was really, really intrigued when I came across a reference to this in a book on the history of cartography that I read some years ago. And I actually found that they started driving me nuts. Quite simply because there are so many different kinds of evidence available to us for these pathways. They also spoke to a strand of theoretical archaeology that I am very interested in, called phenomenology, the idea that we can only understand historical sites through personal experience, through kind of embodied engagement, which is an idea which was articulated in 1994 by Christopher Tilley in his book, The Phenomenology of Landscape, Paths, Monuments and Places. Places, Paths and Monuments. I always get that the wrong way round. And so the idea of the corpse path, the idea of a path which takes on a particular significance in local traditions and which manifests itself in certain ways in the landscape, and for which there are different layers of historical and oral and folkloric testimony. I mean, this seems to me to be a wonderfully interdisciplinary problem. And that's what got me hooked. The corpse road or corpse path was a belief that was known to Shakespeare. And we just had a reference to Midsummer Night's Dream in the question and answer for the previous talk. And now this is a quotation that you will find on any blog post about corpse roads or corpse paths. We all hang on this quotation from one of Puck's soliloquies in A Midsummer Night's Dream, Act 2, Scene 3. Now it is the time of night when the graves all open wide, everyone lets forth its sprite in the churchway paths to glide. Now, this is a reference to the belief closely associated with the idea of the corpse road or the corpse path that the spirit of the deceased had the potential to come back along the roadway and make a nuisance of itself in the community where the person died, in a sense. So this is why in some regions, in some areas, there is a tradition of ensuring that the corpse is carried over running water, over a bridge, because this is said to prevent the spirit from doing this. But this does nonetheless, I think, sort of show that there is a contemporary significance from at least the 17th century of the idea of the corpse path. Now, I sort of trailed that I certainly used to be an archaeologist, so I was particularly excited when I found that there are physical manifestations of corpse paths. Some particularly in the northwest, in Cumbria, and Cumbria is very much corpse path country, as I will be relating shortly. You get a series of these flat coffin stones by the side of the pathway. So this is near Mardale, and I'll be coming back to Mardale in a little more detail shortly. But essentially, these stones provide a place, to rest the coffin down, and you would typically get them every mile or so. And in 2016, the folk rock band Show of Hands produced a song called Along the Old Lichway, which is a direct reference to this belief. And one of the verses goes, "At every mile a marking stone, lay me down, gently down, so they can rest their weary bones along the old Lichway." So the idea, the motif, is one that very much comes through in popular culture. Now, corpse roads are not just a topic of folklore, they are also very much a live topic of the law of the land as well. Because if you think about it, the traversing countryside, including farmland and private land, taps into that truly British obsession, access to the countryside. And, the idea of the corpse road is very much tied up with the idea of access to the countryside. Now, there was, one of the most famous cases in in the history of the right to roam in Britain is the Urton Hall footpath case of 1899. So Urton Hall is a stately pile near Seascale in Cumbria that was, as so often in the second half of the 19th century, purchased by an industrialist of new money, a man called Sir Thomas Brocklebank, who wished to set himself up as a titled landed aristocrat. Now, Sir Thomas purchased Urton Hall, therefore, in the early 1890s, but he took grave exception to this footpath that ran in front of the windows here, which had been in existence for many, many years beforehand. Now, the primary purpose of the footpath was for tenants on the estate to access the church in the middle of the estate. And when Sir Thomas decided to block off access to it, the tenants took him to court. And there was much kind of outrage in the press at the time at the cost and longevity of the court case. It went on for some 3 weeks at a cost of £10 to £15,000, which is an awful lot of money even today, never mind back then, and kind of showing that rage in letters to the press was just as alive at the end of the 19th century as it is in the 21st. This letter to the Spectator of 1st of April 1899 sort of makes reference to these 15 wasted days of Mr. Justice Day's valuable time, 150 witnesses, etc., etc. But it also makes reference to the idea that the church path, the churchway that went over the Urton Hall estate, had been used by tenants out of time immemorial. And it was alleged that by tacit understanding they were only to be used for church-going, but they gradually became used for other purposes as well. Now, this was a theme that was picked up 25 years later in a correspondence in folklore, in the Journal of the Folklore Society, which is, of course, represented here today. So in his letter, or in a letter to folklore, William Self Weeks described the idea that the passage of a coffin party would give rise to a public right-of-way. And this is an idea that took very, very powerful hold in the imagination of the landowning classes at this time. And in reply, L.R. Phelps, who was Provost of Oriel College, Oxford, replied that in many parishes of his experience, the idea of the church path was very, very familiar. And the characteristic was that it was left unploughed. It is a section of the field which is deliberately left unploughed to facilitate the passage of the coffin party. Whereas lesser kinds of paths tended to be ploughed over or used for livestock and thus had to be trodden out every few years. And in fact, the path that Phelps is referring to is the path that I showed on the first slide of this talk, a little 2-mile section of footpath between Littleworth and Farringdon in Oxfordshire, was formerly in Berkshire before the 1970s boundary changes. But one thing I noticed about this path is that you only get these very distinctive sort of dedicated footpath features near the church at Farringdon. They kind of peter out in the middle of the walk. And my kind of barrack room theory for this is that, the fields in the middle were ploughed up in the 1960s in a deliberate effort to try and obscure the path. But my thinking is that the sorts of church paths that Shakespeare was referring to and that others refer to, only occur in the proximity of the burial ground. They are only much more obvious in the proximity of the burial ground. And this was an idea that was picked up in a letter to folklore and an observation. And in fact, A.R. Vickery was in the audience of a talk I gave about this a couple of years ago and was kind enough to come up and point me to this letter that he'd had published. So he noted that in Brixton there was this sign at the front of a private road saying that funerals and hawkers, among various other things, were forbidden. And he was speculating that in this case this was related to this belief that the passage of a funeral may give rise to the establishment of a public footpath. Now, to the best of my knowledge, maybe I'll be delighted to be told differently, that there is no such provision in English law for this sort of thing, but there we go. So, the idea of corpse paths, I was fascinated to discover, was also the subject of folklorists. They were described by folklorists who went into the oral traditions of communities where they existed and wrote them up. Now, one particularly prolific writer, W.T. Palmer, who studied the folklore and traditions of Cumbria in the northwest in great detail, stated in 1915 that some of our mountain hamlets are far from the parish church, which has given rise to the corpse road, which goes straight as a lance to the village centre, but the official who dared to meddle with the corpse road, even though it might not be used once in 20 years, was in for dire trouble. Now, just listening to the fabulous previous talk, it occurred to me that, this writing, this publication, is the same kind of time as the Cottingley Fairies, and I think there is possibly, not a coincidence in that. This was a period when, the paranormal was of great interest, and there was a lot being said about it, so I think that is maybe something interesting to note in the context of the historiography of folklore. Now, I've also discovered recently that there is a connection between corpse roads and alcohol. Funerals are somber experiences, but also they can be fueled as well. And I recently discovered a passage published in 1911 by J. Maxwell Wood, MB, in Witchcraft and Superstitious Record in the Southwestern Districts of Scotland. And he stated, "The culminating feature of the rites of bereavement, the funeral ceremony, was in these old days, particularly between the years 1700 and 1800, an occasion altogether outstanding in social importance. It was an occasion, however, very often marred by profuse liberality and use of stimulants, lavish hospitality in the house of mourning being too frequently followed by ludicrous and extraordinary results as the body was conveyed to its final resting place. A funeral party, for example, had wended their way for miles through deep snow over Eskdale Moor, bound for Moffat churchyard. On arriving at the burial ground, it was actually discovered that they had dropped the coffin by the way, the back having fallen from the cart on which it was being conveyed." Solemn indeed. Anyway, so the corpse road comes through in various different formats, and I was interested to discover that the Ordnance Survey, that familiar bastion of the British landscape, has also got references to corpse roads, as we can see there. So this is a section near Pontefract in Yorkshire, first surveyed in 1846, published in 1852, and I think one can quite interestingly see how the corpse road, or this particular section, has persevered and maintained as parcels of land ownership have changed. So, you can also observe the old coal pits. Now you have the miners' sports ground, so you can see the corpse path carrying on in the background there. And, this section here is this section here. So those trees that were obviously quite young in 1938 have kind of grown up, and you can start sort of tracing what's going on through the history of the map. So now to move on to my favourite corpse road, my personal favourite, which is at North Otterington in North Yorkshire, and it is even labelled as a corpse road by the signposts. So this corpse road connects the hamlet of Thornton-le-Beans, just on the western edge of the North Yorkshire moors, with the church of St Michael and All Angels at North Otterington. And I had a chance to visit there last summer. I spoke to the incumbent vicar and also the church warden, and when I said to her that I was interested in the corpse road, she said, "Oh yes, we've got two," and the pride of ownership in her voice was just marvellous, really. But there it is, going across the field to the church there. I was particularly pleased that I got some threatening, lowering clouds over it. That was total fluke, that. But you might not be able to see this, but on this 1857 Ordnance Survey map, the corpse road is marked as crossing the railway line here. Then it turns north and gets picked up again right here and meets up with the main road, and then turns south to the church at North Archaeology here. However, and there it is, by the way, on the modern Ordnance Survey map. So persisting through the countryside, persisting through time again. But interestingly, this is wrong. Okay, this bridleway is in fact this bridleway here. It does not deviate at all to the north round Otterington Grange, And that wooden corpse road signpost is just right at the end of the path, right here. So what has happened is, for some reason, the Ordnance Survey surveyors has recorded this artificial and incorrect and actually geographically illogical dogleg here. Why might this be? Well, we don't know for sure, but given the issues around passage of a corpse causing a public footpath and so forth, I think it is not at all implausible that the owners of Otterington Grange, now Otterington Farm here, had somehow contrived for this to be recorded as thus on the Ordnance Survey. So, now for the digital landscape archaeology bit. Okay. So W.T. Palmer, who I quoted before, writing a little earlier in 1908, talks about the present little church at Mardale in Cumbria, dating back some 200 years, but without a consecrated churchyard. And so for this reason, a corpse road was established over the moors from Mardale to Brampton and onwards to Shap Abbey. And Mardale itself is now actually flooded. It was flooded in the 1930s to form Haweswater Reservoir because the growing city of Manchester needed a bigger water supply. So I thought I would try and put some data files together as a kind of idle exercise for my students to see if we can reconstruct this notional corpse road from 4 different data sets. The US Geological Survey's elevation data for Cumbria, so data above sea level, modern features such as towns, waterways, rivers, and so forth, somebody's private project to digitize and put online all modern rights of way, which is this last one, and finally the historic Ordnance Survey data for the region. So if we overlay the first and second of those, the modern features with the USGS survey data, and then put the waterway on, you can immediately fill in the reservoir, which you can see right here. There is Shap Abbey, and Mardale is actually right here. Now this becomes more obvious when we put the digital, this is actually a 1924 Ordnance Survey map over this, but you can then see that the modern water level is very much greater, because it was flooded artificially, than the original reservoir. And you can actually see Mardale, probably can't make it out, but it's just right there. You then overlay the right-of-way data, and that's what this green line is. It kind of wends its way off to the south here, but is picked up by the metal road network, picked up again by the right-of-way network right here, until this point where there is a kind of unaccounted for bit. So, it's just quite interesting. I mean, it's not massively analytical, but it is a way of sort of using disparate data sets, disparate bits of digital mapping to kind of bring out some of these rather woolly historical aspects. Okay, so I'm nearly out of time, so I'm going to wrap up. Corpse roads are surprisingly prevalent in popular culture. I mentioned a song with lyrics referring to it, but there are numerous manifestations of the idea in literature, in art, in the popular imagination. And I think it is precisely because of this aspect which I referred to at the beginning, the kind of interdisciplinary coming together of all these things which make folklore fascinating, coming together with things like access to the countryside, the law of the land, and sort of aspects of the emotional power of the rituals of death. And also, corpse roads are, to one extent or another, right here with us in London to this day. There are, I think, about a dozen church paths in the London A to Z. I'm old enough to remember such a thing, certainly. But also Churchway, Church Path in Trafalgar Square, and the Tyburn Tree site in Bayswater, near Marble Arch, which marks the point of the Tyburn Gallows, and which possibly gives Oxford Street the distinction of being possibly the first original corpse road, but there we go, that's another story. Anyway, I think that's all I have time for, so maybe there's time for a couple of questions. Thank you.
I
tell you what we're going to do. I've just been told we can take questions at the end of the next talk as well for the both of you. So
Fine.
there will be questions just in about 25 minutes' time.
Super.
So thank you very much, Stuart.
Thank you.